I think I didn't do anything wrong. Just joked with my friends like everyone does. It wasn't meant to hurt him, not really. But the day he stood in court and laid down those printed messages in front of the judge, I realized I'd laughed myself straight out of a marriage. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I think I didn't do anything wrong, just laughed with my friends the way everyone does. It was a stupid joke in a private chat, something we'd all forget the next day. But apparently my husband didn't. He remembered every word, enough to print it, file it, and hand it to a judge like evidence in a crime. I still don't understand why it mattered so much. It wasn't like I'd lied. It started harmlessly, or at least that's what I told myself. I work at a small dental clinic in Salem. Clean teeth, calm patients, and gossip to keep us alive. The group chat with the girls, molars and margaritas, was where we dumped everything we couldn't say out loud. Complaints about patients, our partners, little frustrations that turned into jokes. There was Lena, my closest friend, loud and clever. Ryan, one of the dental assistants, was the only man in the group and the biggest flirt. Everyone teased everyone. That's just how it was. Tom never liked that part of me. He said I didn't know when to stop joking. He said people weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at someone. Usually him. I used to roll my eyes and say, "That's because you don't get humor." He'd shrug, like I was confirming something he already believed. We'd been married 8 years, and he'd become boring, predictable. He'd wake up early, make Ellie's lunch, go to work, come home tired, sit on the couch, and fall asleep halfway through a show. I'd sit beside him, phone in hand, messaging the girls. Sometimes he'd glance over and ask, "Who's keeping you so busy?" I'd say, "You wouldn't know them." He never pushed. That was the thing about Tom. He thought silence made him strong. I mistook it for weakness. One night, after another argument about nothing, I typed in the chat, "He's sulking again." You'd think after 8 years he'd stop acting like I owe him cheerleading practice every night. Lena sent back a laughing emoji. Ryan replied, "Maybe he just can't keep up." I laughed, sitting right beside Tom, who was pretending to watch TV. Lena said I was too harsh. I said, "It's true though, he takes everything personally." Ryan jumped in, probably because he knows he's not exactly impressive. The thread exploded with laughing emojis. I shouldn't have joined, but I did. I wrote, "If you only knew how right you are." That line became the seed of everything that followed. Tom turned and asked what was so funny. I said, "It's work stuff." He didn't argue. He just stared for a moment, long enough to make me uncomfortable, then turned back to the screen. I should have stopped there, but instead I doubled down. I typed, "Even his silence is small." The girls sent rows of emojis again. I laughed out loud that time. At work, the chat became our little sport. Ryan loved feeding me lines. Harmless at first, then bolder. He'd whisper, "You really don't deserve a man who doesn't even try." I'd roll my eyes and say, "I'm married, not buried." He'd grin and say, "Same thing sometimes." I liked the attention. It made me feel alive in a way home didn't. Tom started noticing the distance. He'd come home early sometimes, hoping to eat dinner together, but I'd be glued to my phone. He'd ask if we could have a no-screen night. I told him not to act controlling. He said, "I just want to see your face, not your reflection in a screen." I laughed and said, "Then make it worth looking at." He didn't answer. Lena pulled me aside one day after work and said, "You're going too far with the jokes." I said, "It's just venting." She said, "No, it's getting cruel." I brushed her off. "You sound like him," I said. She didn't reply, but her silence stayed with me longer than I expected. That weekend, Tom's mother, Martha, came over to help with Ellie's school project. She made polite conversation, but her tone was sharp. She said, "You're always laughing these days." "That's good, I suppose. I said, "I try to find joy where I can." She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Just make sure you're not laughing at the wrong things." When she left, I told Tom his mother was passive-aggressive. He said, "She's just observant." I said, "Then she should observe her own life." He said, "She does. That's why she knows what's happening in ours." I froze, unsure what he meant. He didn't explain. That night, I sent another message to the group chat. "He's getting weirdly suspicious." "Maybe he finally found his spine." Ryan wrote back, "Maybe he found your chat history." I laughed at that too. It seemed impossible. Tom didn't even lock his phone properly. Later, while he was brushing his teeth, I saw his reflection watching me through the mirror. I asked what his problem was. He said, "Nothing. Just thinking." I said, "That's dangerous for you." He smiled slightly, but it wasn't his usual smile. It was quiet, tight, almost sad. Over the next few days, he barely spoke. He still made Ellie's breakfast, still fixed the loose cabinet door, still acted like everything was normal. But something had changed. When I asked if he was mad, he said, "No, I'm just listening." I didn't know what he meant, but I felt uneasy. On Friday, Ryan texted me, "We should have a drink after work, just us." I told him no at first, then changed my mind. At the bar, we laughed too loudly, drank too much. He made another joke about Mr. Small Effort. I laughed again and sent it to the chat. Ryan just said Tom probably carries a measuring tape to feel better. The chat went wild. I was drunk on attention, on laughter that wasn't silent or heavy. When I got home, Tom was still awake. He was sitting on the couch, my phone in his hand. He said, "You left this unlocked." I said, "And you went through it?" He said, "I didn't have to. The messages popped up." I said, "You're overreacting." He said, "Am I?" I tried to grab the phone, but he handed it back calmly and said, "Don't worry, I already made copies." I froze. He stood, kissed Ellie's forehead in the hallway, and went to bed without another word. The next morning, he was gone before sunrise. On the table, he'd left my phone and a printed page, my words from the chat, highlighted in yellow. The last line I'd written glared up at me like a confession. Even his silence is small. The morning after he left that note, I told myself it was nothing. He wouldn't actually do anything. Tom was the kind of man who avoided conflict, who sulked quietly until things went back to normal. That was how our marriage worked. He ignored, I mocked, we repeated. So I went to work like nothing happened. I told Lena he'd read my messages, but I made it sound funny, like a sitcom moment. She didn't laugh. She said, "Celia, that's not funny. He could use that against you." I said, "Against me? For what? Bad humor?" She shook her head and muttered, "You don't get it." When I got home, the house felt colder. His shoes were gone from the door, a few drawers half empty, his toothbrush missing. I called him, straight to voicemail. I texted, "You're being dramatic." No reply. By Sunday, even Ellie noticed. She asked, "Where's Daddy?" I said, "He's just staying with Grandma for a bit." She frowned and said, "Did you fight?" I smiled too quickly. "Of course not, sweetheart." She stared like she didn't believe me. That afternoon, Martha called. Her tone was polite but sharp enough to draw blood. "Tom's taking a few days," she said. "He needs space." I said, "He's overreacting." She said, "He's processing." I said, "You make it sound like I hurt him." She said, "You did." Then she hung up. I spent the next few days alternating between guilt and annoyance. Ryan kept texting, "You okay?" I replied, "Fine." He wrote back, "He'll cool off." I wanted to believe him, so I let myself laugh again, pretending the world hadn't shifted under me. Lena stopped talking to me. At lunch, she sat with the hygienists instead of our usual table. When I asked if she was mad, she said, "I just don't want to be involved." I said, "In what?" She said, "Whatever you've turned this into." On Wednesday, Tom came by to pick up Ellie for school. He looked calm. Too calm. He said, "I'll drop her off tonight." I asked if we could talk. He said, "Not yet." I followed him to the door. "So that's it," I said. He looked at me, eyes tired but steady. "You said enough already." Then he left. That night, I opened the group chat again. It was quiet now. No one had posted in days. I typed, "So apparently my husband can't take a joke." Lena didn't reply. Ryan sent a single emoji, then nothing else. For the first time, the silence felt heavy. A few days later, a plain white envelope appeared in the mailbox. No return address, just my name written in his handwriting. Inside were printed screenshots, my own words, our chat thread, highlighted and dated. At the bottom, a short note. "Keep them. You'll need them soon." My heart raced. I called him immediately. He didn't answer. I left a message. "You're insane if you think this proves anything. Everyone jokes like that." I regretted saying it the second I hung up. When I told Ryan about the envelope, he went pale. "You should delete the chat," he said. I said, "It's too late." He printed it. Ryan swore under his breath and said, "You didn't actually say his name in there, did you?" I said, "Of course I did. It's my husband." He ran a hand through his hair. "Celia, you're going to need a lawyer." That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that highlighted line again. Even his silence is small. I started rewriting it in my head, trying to make it sound less cruel. But there was no version of it that didn't sound like I meant it. The next morning, I took Ellie to school and drove straight to Martha's house. I told myself I'd reason with her, get her to make Tom stop this nonsense. When she opened the door, she looked unsurprised to see me. "You shouldn't be here," she said. I said, "You're turning him against me." She said, "He doesn't need my help to see the truth." I said, "He's destroying our family over some stupid screenshots." She said, "No, you did that when you decided to share your marriage like gossip." I tried to explain, but she just shook her head. "He's not angry," she said softly. "He's focused. That's worse." Driving home, I started shaking. I told myself she was bluffing, that Tom wouldn't actually take it that far. He wasn't like that. He didn't like making scenes. But maybe that was the problem. He was finally learning to. At work, the tension was unbearable. Ryan avoided me, pretending to be busy. Lena refused eye contact. The clinic manager pulled me aside and said, "I heard there's some drama. Keep it outside the office." I wanted to ask who told her, but I already knew. That night, I tried calling Tom again. This time he answered. His voice was calm, almost kind. "Stop calling me," he said. "We'll talk when it's official." I said, "What's official?" He said, "You'll see." Then the line went dead. The next day, a courier arrived at the clinic asking for my signature. Everyone stared as I signed for the package. Inside was a thick envelope from a law office, notice of separation and custody proceedings. I felt my stomach drop. At home, I threw the documents on the table and poured wine. The words blurred as I read: grounds, emotional cruelty, defamation, marital misconduct. Attached was a detailed log, dates, messages, screenshots, even the night I'd been at the bar with Ryan. He'd documented everything. I called Lena in panic. "He can't do this," I said. She was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "He can. Those messages, they weren't jokes, Celia. They were mean." I said, "You're supposed to be my friend." She said, "I was, until you made me part of your cruelty." Then she hung up. Later, when I picked up Ellie from school, she asked why Daddy wasn't home anymore. I said, "He's just working things out." She said, "He told my teacher I'll stay with him for a while." My throat went dry. That night, I sat on the couch, surrounded by papers and empty glasses, scrolling through the group chat one last time. Every line that had once made me laugh now looked different, like evidence written in my own hand. I thought of deleting it, but what was the point? The damage was already done, and Tom had the copies. I messaged Ryan. "He's serious. He's taking me to court," he replied after a long pause. "Then you need to take this seriously too," I typed. "He won't win." He didn't reply. Outside, the wind rattled the window. I looked around the empty living room, the wine glass trembling in my hand, and said out loud, "He can't win." But my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. The first court notice came 2 weeks later, folded neatly in another cream envelope. I held it for hours before opening it, as if waiting might change what it said. Preliminary hearing scheduled, parties to appear with counsel. The words looked official, distant, not like my life at all. Tom's name was printed beside mine, but there was no warmth in seeing them together. Just a border between two sides of a war I hadn't realized I'd started. I called him, ignoring his earlier request to stop. He answered this time, voice even, detached. I said, "You don't really want this, do you?" He said, "It's already in motion." I said, "You're making a mistake." He said, "I made it 8 years ago." Then he hung up. I threw the phone across the room and screamed until my throat hurt. Ellie came running from her room, eyes wide. "Mummy, what's wrong?" she asked. I said, "Nothing, baby, just a noise." She said, "Like Daddy leaving?" And before I could answer, she turned and went back to bed. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had happened. But everyone already knew. News travels faster than shame. The whispers stopped when I entered the break room. Ryan was at the sink rinsing a cup. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I said, "Did you tell them?" He said, "They already knew." I said, "You started this." He said, "No, you did, when you forgot how cruel you sounded." I wanted to slap him, but instead I smiled tightly and said, "You'll regret crossing me." He said, "You're still talking like you have power." I left early that day. When I got home, a dark car was parked across the street. A man stepped out and introduced himself as Daniel Wu, Tom's attorney. "This is standard procedure," he said, handing me another document. "My client prefers we communicate formally." I said, "Your client is my husband." He said, "Legally, he's the petitioner now." His calm tone made my stomach twist. Inside was another set of papers, financial statements, custody proposals, an evidence list that made me want to tear the pages apart. Each item was numbered, screenshots, text logs, even witness statements. At the bottom of the list, I saw Lena's name. I called her immediately. "You gave him statements," I said. She was quiet for a long time, then said, "He didn't force me. He just asked what really happened." I said, "You're betraying me." She said, "No, you betrayed yourself." Then she hung up. I went into overdrive after that, calling lawyers, deleting chats, trying to control the narrative. My attorney, a thin woman named Janet, flipped through the papers and sighed. "You handed him everything," she said. "These messages aren't defensible." I said, "They were jokes." She said, "They were defamation." I said, "Of who? My husband?" She said, "Exactly." I tried to argue that Tom had violated my privacy by taking screenshots. Janet said, "He didn't hack you. He saw what popped up on a shared device. That's admissible." Then she added more softly, "If you want to salvage custody, stop calling him." I didn't stop. That night I called again anyway. No answer. So I left a message. "You're ruining Ellie's life. Are you proud?" He didn't reply, but the next morning I got a message from Daniel Wu's office. All communication to go through counsel. Continued contact may affect custody recommendations. I felt trapped, like the world had tilted, and I was the only one still pretending it was level. Martha showed up 2 days later, unannounced. She didn't knock. She just stepped inside, holding a box of Ellie's things. "Tom asked me to bring these," she said. "He's getting her room ready." I said, "She's not moving anywhere." She said, That's not your decision anymore. I said, You're enjoying this, aren't you? She said, No, I'm mourning what you destroyed. She placed the box on the counter and turned to leave, but then she stopped at the door. You thought laughing at him made you powerful, she said, but it only showed how small you were. I said, You don't know what our marriage was like. She said, I know what respect looks like, and I never saw it in you. Then she walked out. That night I poured wine and scrolled through the old chat again, reading each message slowly. The words that once felt funny now felt sharp and ugly. Even his silence is small. He's lucky he's nice. Nothing else is remarkable. Maybe he should take notes from Ryan. Every line was poison with my signature at the bottom. My phone buzzed. A new message from a number I didn't recognize. Prepare for hearing. Discovery materials attached. It was a link to a shared folder. Against Janet's advice, I opened it. Inside were PDFs of every message, neatly formatted, with timestamps and contact names. He'd built a case like a blueprint, every detail precise. I spent the night writing a message to Tom, deleting and rewriting it over and over. At one point I typed, You win. I'm sorry, but I couldn't send it. Sorry wouldn't undo what I'd said, and winning sounded too much like what he was doing. Calmly, efficiently, legally. When I picked up Ellie from school the next day, she said, Daddy says we might move closer to Grandma. I said, You wouldn't like that, would you? She said, Daddy said it's quiet there. I like quiet. That hurt more than any legal document. That evening, I drove to his temporary apartment just to see if he'd answer the door. He didn't. But through the window, I saw him sitting with Ellie, helping her draw. He looked relaxed, almost happy. I waited outside for 10 minutes before driving home, telling myself he'd regret it later. When I got back, another envelope was on the doorstep. Inside was a note in his handwriting. For your records. Attached was a printed photo of one of my messages, blown up like a poster. The one where I'd written, Imagine being married to a man who can't even take a joke. I dropped it on the floor, sat down, and whispered, It was just a joke. But even I didn't believe myself anymore. The hearing was set for mid-March, but the waiting was worse than the event itself. Every day felt like standing in front of a slow, quiet avalanche that hadn't decided when to fall. I spent hours rehearsing things I'd say to him, lines that made me sound confident, wronged, misunderstood. I'd tell the judge that Tom was cold, that his silence had pushed me to vent. I'd use that word a lot, venting. It sounded softer than mocking. Janet, my lawyer, told me to keep a low profile. No social media, she said. No comments, no friends defending you, nothing. I nodded, then ignored her completely. I posted a photo of myself drinking coffee with the caption, Some people mistake humor for cruelty when they can't laugh at themselves. The post got 30 likes, mostly from co-workers who didn't know the full story. But Lena did. She messaged me privately. Delete it. It's embarrassing. I wrote back, You used to laugh. She replied, And then I grew up. The clinic finally called me into HR. My manager, Claire, looked uncomfortable as she read from a printed sheet. There have been concerns about your conduct outside work. We're asking you to take some personal time. I said, You're firing me because my husband can't handle a joke. She said, We're not firing you. We're protecting the clinic's image. The word image made me laugh out loud. I walked out before she could finish her sentence. That evening, I called Ryan out of pure frustration. He didn't pick up. He hadn't picked up in weeks. I left a message saying, You don't get to disappear when things get hard. The next day, he texted, HR asked about me too. I can't be seen with you right now. Just like that, my biggest ally turned into another ghost. At home, I tried calling Tom again. No answer. When I emailed Daniel Wu's office, his assistant responded, Please direct all non-custodial communication through counsel only. Mr. Vane has no comment. Even the phrasing, no comment, felt like something from a newspaper, not a marriage. Martha dropped by again, uninvited, holding one of Ellie's school drawings. It showed 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, one missing. Ellie drew this at her father's, she said. She said the missing one is you. I said, that's dramatic. Martha said, children aren't dramatic, they're honest. I told her to leave. She said, you should be in court preparing, not in denial. I said, he's turning everyone against me. She said, you did that yourself. He just stopped protecting you from the truth. Then she placed the drawing on the counter and left. That night, I stared at the picture until the colors blurred. The missing figure suddenly looked less like an absence and more like a shadow, something erased on purpose. The next day, Janet called to review Tom's new filing. He's added a defamation claim, she said. He's arguing the group chat damaged his reputation at work. I said, that's ridiculous. None of his co-workers even saw it. She said, they did now. He submitted printed messages with your name, date, and his contact photo visible. I felt my stomach drop. When I asked how he even got them formatted like that, Janet said, he's an electrician, right? He knows systems, backups, cloud storage. He documented everything neatly. Judges love that. I told her we needed to fight back. She said, fight what? Your own words? That night I drove to his apartment again, but the lights were off. I sat in the car for nearly an hour before realizing how pathetic I looked. When I got home, another envelope was waiting. This one was thicker, heavier. Inside was the full court packet, pages upon pages of every message I'd sent. Not just the jokes about him, but the ones to Ryan too. Every flirt, every petty insult, every laugh. The worst one was highlighted in red. Sometimes I think I'd respect him more if he just left me. He must have seen that before he actually did. I dropped the papers, shaking. My mind twisted for excuses, but none came. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It was supposed to be harmless banter. I wasn't the villain. I was just unappreciated. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamt of the courtroom. Tom stood in front of a judge, holding those same pages, reading them out loud. Every laugh echoed until it didn't sound like laughter anymore. It sounded like breaking glass. The morning of the hearing, I woke up with a migraine and a sense of dread that settled in my chest like wet sand. Janet met me outside the courthouse. She said, be calm. Speak only when asked. Don't defend the jokes. Admit regret, not guilt. Inside, the air felt too still. Tom was already there, sitting beside Daniel. He looked composed, almost gentle. When I entered, he didn't look up. I wanted him to look at me, to see that I was scared, that I hadn't meant it. But he didn't. The judge entered, papers in hand. She read through the filing slowly, her face unreadable. These group messages, she said, flipping pages, were shared with co-workers. I nodded. She said, and you consented to this being sent from your device? I said, it wasn't malicious. It was venting. She asked, do you think this language is consistent with love? I said, it's consistent with frustration. Daniel spoke next. Calm, professional. He said, Mr. Vane doesn't wish for retribution. He only seeks to protect his child and dignity. Then he handed over the printed chat, bound, tabbed, and numbered. Tom didn't say a word. When the judge finished reviewing it, she looked at me. Mrs. Vane, she said, do you understand the gravity of your words? I wanted to scream that it was just humor, that people laughed because they related. Instead, I whispered, I didn't mean it like that. She said, intent doesn't erase harm. As we left the courtroom, Tom paused by the door. For the first time in months, he looked at me. You got your laughs, he said softly. I'm just getting my piece. He walked out before I could respond. That night, the house was unbearable. Every echo sounded like mockery, every empty chair like punishment. I poured wine, and scrolled through the messages again. The words didn't make me laugh this time. They made me feel sick. When I looked at the clock, it was past midnight. My phone buzzed once. A notification from Janet. The judge's written decision will be delivered next week. I stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "He's already won." And I knew I was right. The week before the decision dragged like a punishment. Every day I checked my email, waiting for something, an update, a sign, anything to tell me that Tom might soften. Nothing came. Even Janet stopped sugarcoating. She said, "The judge's impression is clear. Your best chance now is to show remorse." I said, "I already said I didn't mean it." She said, "That's not remorse. That's denial in nicer clothes." I started rehearsing apologies, out loud, in front of the mirror. I was wrong, I'd say. I never intended to hurt him. But even when I tried to sound sincere, I could still hear the old me, the voice that always needed to be right. I hated how fake it sounded. Lena called unexpectedly one evening. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, she said, "You're on thin ice, Celia." I said, "What else is new?" She sighed. "Tom's not out for blood. He just wants distance." I said, "He's getting plenty of that." She said, "No, he's getting closure. There's a difference." Before I could ask what she meant, she hung up. When I arrived at the courthouse for the final hearing, Tom was already there, sitting at the table with Daniel. He looked well, clean-shaven, rested, wearing the calm of someone who'd already accepted the outcome. I, on the other hand, was shaking. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The judge began by summarizing the case. Her voice was flat but clear. "The petitioner," she said, "has demonstrated consistent emotional harm through public ridicule, defamation, and digital misconduct." Each word felt like a strike of a hammer. When she read my name, it didn't sound like me anymore. It sounded like a headline. Daniel presented the evidence again, methodically, page by page. He spoke without venom, just precision. When he reached the section of the chat labeled Intimate Derogation, he paused. "These messages," he said, "were shared among co-workers and include repeated insults about physical attributes, shared photos of the petitioner, and comments comparing him to another man." He didn't need to say Ryan's name. Everyone in the room already knew. The judge glanced at me. "Is this accurate?" she asked. I said, "They were jokes." She said, "Were they funny?" I didn't answer. Then Daniel handed her a folder. "Your Honor," he said, "my client has provided printed transcripts with context and timestamps. He wishes to submit these not out of spite, but to demonstrate pattern." The judge flipped through a few pages, then looked at me again. "Mrs. Vane, your words speak louder than your defense." Tom still hadn't spoken. Not once. He sat there, hands folded, eyes on the table, looking like a man who'd already said everything worth saying. Janet whispered to me, "Stay calm, don't react." But I couldn't stop. "He's making me look like a monster," I said. The judge raised her hand. "Mrs. Vane, you did that yourself." Silence followed, thick, humiliating. When the court broke for recess, I rushed to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall. I could still hear the judge's voice echoing. Were they funny? I leaned against the wall, dizzy. I thought about Ryan, who'd vanished completely, probably laughing about me somewhere else. I thought about Lena, who'd chosen truth over friendship, and then I thought about Tom, quiet, calm, collecting proof, while I'd been too busy trying to win every argument. When we reconvened, the judge allowed closing remarks. Janet spoke gently, pleading that I was remorseful, that my actions were misguided, not malicious. Daniel didn't even bother rebutting. He simply said, "My client has no further words. His silence is his statement." That was the final nail. The judge sighed and closed the file. "I'll review the final orders in chambers," she said. "You'll receive them within the week. Until then, all financial and custodial arrangements remain under temporary control of the petitioner." As everyone stood, I turned to Tom. "You could stop this," I whispered. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, just exhaustion. "I already tried," he said. Then he walked out. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. No one cared except the few people who'd watched my humiliation up close. The sky was grey, and I realized how fitting it was, that something so devastating could look so ordinary. When I got home, the house felt smaller than ever. I poured wine, even though it was barely noon. The TV flickered in the background, muted. I picked up one of the court copies Tom had given me weeks ago. My words stared back at me, black and final. Even his silence is small. I whispered them aloud, and they sounded childish, cruel, desperate for attention. Then I flipped the page and saw the last entry from the chat, the one I'd forgotten about. Ryan had written, "You're lucky he's too nice to ever fight back." And I'd replied, "Then I guess I'll never lose." I felt sick. He'd read that one too. No wonder he never yelled, never cursed. He'd already found his way to win, legally, quietly, decisively. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing him standing in court, calm while the judge read my own cruelty out loud. I'd spent years mocking his silence, and now it was the only thing I heard. The next morning, I checked my email. There was a single message from Janet. "Decision expected Friday. Be prepared for full custodial transfer and asset separation." I closed the laptop, sat in the quiet, and waited. There was nothing left to fight for except noise, and noise was what had destroyed me. By the end of the week, the envelope arrived. Thick, official, irreversible. I held it for a long time before opening it, tracing his name on the seal. For a brief moment, I wished he'd at least yelled, that he'd given me something to answer back to. But all I had was paper, and silence that didn't need defending. The judgment inside was exactly what I expected. He got custody. He got the house. He got peace. And I got proof that silence had always been louder than my laughter. The judgment became official on a Thursday morning. A courier handed me the envelope at my door, polite and detached, as if he were delivering a package instead of the end of my life. Inside were stamped pages with black ink that didn't smudge, even when my hand shook. Custody awarded to petitioner. Primary residence awarded to petitioner. Visitation under review. I read the lines over and over, hoping they'd rearrange themselves into something merciful. They didn't. I sat on the floor of the living room surrounded by paper, the morning light cutting through the curtains. The house felt hollow. His things were already gone, yet it still smelled faintly like his aftershave, a quiet reminder that I'd lost to someone who never even raised his voice. I tried to tell myself it was unfair, that he'd overreacted, that jokes shouldn't end marriages. But deep down, I knew he'd just held a mirror to me and made me look at what I really was. Janet called later that afternoon. "It's done," she said. "The judge signed the final order." I asked if there was anything I could do. She said, "No, just comply. Don't make things worse." Then she paused. For what it's worth, he didn't gloat. He just said he hoped this closes the noise. Closes the noise. That was Tom's victory. Silence, peace, the one thing I'd never given him. I poured a drink and scrolled through the old group chat again. It was dead now. The messages were months old, frozen in time, each one uglier than I remembered. My words stared back at me, small and mean. Even his silence is small. He's lucky I haven't left. Imagine living with that every night. The laughter emojis underneath looked like confessions now. I typed a new message. I ruined everything, but deleted it before sending. No one would reply anyway. That evening, Lena texted for the first time in weeks. "I heard it's over. I hope you're okay." I stared at the message, then typed. He showed the chat to the judge. Every word. She replied, "Then maybe now you'll stop calling cruelty humor." I didn't answer. When the sun went down, I drove to Martha's house. I told myself it was to see Ellie, but really, I wanted proof that some part of my old life still existed. When I arrived, Ellie was playing in the front yard, drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. She looked up when she saw me. For a second, I thought she might run over. Instead, she smiled shyly and waved. "Hi, Mummy." Her voice was soft, uncertain. Martha stepped out a moment later and said, "This isn't a good time." I said, "I just want to say hello." She said, "You can say it during visitation, not like this." Ellie looked between us, confused. I said, "I'll see you soon, okay?" She nodded, then went back to drawing. I stood there until Martha quietly closed the door. Driving home, I felt emptier than I thought possible. I'd spent months mocking Tom's quiet, calling it weakness. Now it surrounded me like air, everywhere, constant, impossible to escape. When I walked inside, another envelope waited on the kitchen counter. My name written in his handwriting, steady as always. I opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. "I won't respond anymore. Please go through the mediator. I hope you find peace too." I laughed at that, an ugly, hollow sound that startled even me. Peace was the one thing I'd never know again. I sat by the window with my drink, watching the empty street. The laughter that had once filled my days felt foreign now, like it belonged to someone else. The phone buzzed once, a voicemail from an unknown number. I pressed play. It was Ellie's voice, small and serious. "Daddy says we don't make fun of people we love. I think he's right." I dropped the phone. The message kept replaying until the words blurred into quiet. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a clever answer. I just sat there, listening to the silence Tom had built for himself, and realized it was the only thing he'd ever asked for. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.